All right, here we are for another AP Biology video. This is the next in our evolution unit set of videos. And as you can see, it's going to be about speciation. We've spent some time now talking about natural selection. Natural selection is the main driver of evolution, and natural selection causes changes in allele frequency. We know that the peppered moth went from mostly a light population to mostly dark population. We know that there are humans that have adaptations like the Bajau people who have a big spleen, right? Species can and do change over time. That has been witnessed, and we know that that's a fact. But just by going from a light population to a dark population, or just getting a big spleen, that doesn't make you a new species, right? Like that's just one little trait from a lot of other kinds of traits. And so the question now would be, how we know that things change, but how do we get all these different species out there? How do we get big differences and not just small differences, right? So that's the topic of this video. Now, before we talk about how it happens, we need to make sure we know what a species means, at least from a scientific point of view. A species would be a different from another species if they are unable to mate. Basically, if two organisms can mate, then we would consider them the same species. If they can't mate, then they wouldn't be the same species. The weird little like in between there, and where in reality it gets a little more difficult, is that sometimes two species can mate, but they don't produce fertile offspring. The babies of the mating cannot have their own babies. And so that's a kind of an interesting twist on the whole thing that we'll get to towards the end of the video, right? But two organisms are too different to mate, then they must be this different species. Now, there's two main ways that this would happen, that people understand this as happening. The first one is when one group slowly changes into something totally different. And this is called gradualism. And a great example of it would be these horses. The horse ancestor was small, kind of a deer-like organism, although it did have actual toes, like kind of a dog paw on a deer body, sort of. And they were about the size of a large dog or a small deer. They lived in an environment that was partially wooded, at least, if not like full on like a forest. And this was good if you're a small deer-like animal, because the forest provides you protection and shade. And if a predator is chasing you, you can dodge in between the trees and evade in that manner. But over time, the forests became more and more sparse until they eventually became the grasslands that they are now. And so as the trees go away, the ability for the deer-like horse ancestors to dart in between those trees is going to, of course, go away. And so different traits become more beneficial in this environment. And one of those traits is just pure speed. And pure speed is often about size. So as you can see, the horse ancestor got bigger and bigger and bigger until they're the size of the horses that we have now, right? So over time, gradually changing into a bigger animal. Their feet gradually went from 4 toes down to 3 toes because the two middle ones fused together. Then those two middle ones get real big and the two side ones get small. Then the two side ones aren't even really there. And then finally we have like a full-on hoof, like a modern horse has. And again, that's because of the change to going for just speed, that a hoof is good because you don't like stub your toes and like break your toes or something when you're trying to run as fast as you can away from the like pack of wolves that's behind you, right? Now, the thing about this kind of evolution that really trips people up is that it is really slow. And so you don't really get to appreciate it when it's happening now for humans as we look out on the species that are out there, because you can't really tell the differences between these things. And so one example that I tried to do here was to show how the babies of one parent are not very different from the parent. But as you let time go on, the differences pile up so that you can see at the end of the whole story, they're way different than where they began. But each step along the way isn't very big. And so that's what I'm trying to show here with, maybe it was supposed to be a rabbit, I guess. And at the beginning, the rabbit ancestor doesn't have very big ears. And then it has its baby, and if I could have done this right, the baby's ears would have been just the tiniest bit bigger. And I tried to make it so that that one's just a little bit bigger, right? And so if you compare from this one to this one, you could say, oh yeah, well, I mean, they're not the same, but you could totally see how this could be the baby that came from this one, right? And that would go for all these, that you could see how this one could be the baby or the parent of the next one, even though that one's the worst one, like I didn't do a very good job. It's significantly bigger, right? But then I got a little better right here, where the difference between these two is very, very small. And the difference between these two is very, very small. And the difference between these two is very, very small. But when you look at the end compared to the beginning, the difference is very large, right? And so when this whole thing takes, 60 million years, then definitely it's going to be hard to appreciate that evolution is even happening. But still, this is the main way that people have you're taught this way in lower grades, that there's these slow changes that build up. And one of the things about this is that it leads people to thinking this is the only way it happens. And you get questions like, if humans came from chimps, then how come there are still chimps on the planet, right? Because just like on these horses, now that we have these guys, these ones don't exist. And let's just go directly back to this one. These pliohippus, I don't know how you're supposed to say that. They don't exist anymore, but not because they went extinct. They just slowly changed thanks to natural selection to now become the full-on horses, right? And so this makes people again say like, well, if humans came from chimps, then how come there are still chimps? And that's because there's a whole second type of speciation where two groups will diverge. This is called divergent speciation. And when the two groups diverge, then they can start to evolve separately and become new species, right? So in this version, we have the gradualism kind of example, where the dark blue slowly turned into those light blue birds. But then in this example, the dark blue population split into two groups. One group stayed pretty much the same, whereas the other group then changes into the light blue version, right? And so that's called divergent speciation, right? And it's a very important that the first way doesn't give you new species, or doesn't give you any more species, because you lost one as you gained the other one. But divergent speciation means that you're going to actually get more and more and more species as we go along, which of course is what we see in the fossil record that we'll talk about later. And so whether it happens because of the divergent speciation happens in a lot of different ways. The main thing that has to happen, though, is there's got to be something called reproductive isolation, that you have to get the sex to not be as random or as possible. Genetically isolated populations evolve separately. Here's what I mean. I got my population of gray dot species, right? And they're all in there, and they can all mate with each other whenever it's time for mating or whatever it is. And then at some point, a mutation, of course, occurs in the population. Let's just call it the red mutation. And if the red mutation is a beneficial one, it'll start to spread through the population over the generations, of course, right? It doesn't literally spread like a virus would. But over time, we would expect this to become the red dot population. But what if there's a barrier, something that keeps the populations isolated? Now we'll get this group will all eventually become the red dots, but the gray ones will stay, and so they will be different. But not only will the gray ones be different, but maybe other mutations happen in the gray population on the right, the blue mutation, and that mutation is only going to happen inside of that group. So we started with one population that was the gray group, and now we end up with two populations, the red and the blue group, and those are significantly different from each other, right? And so different mutations will arise in the gene pools, which will allow them to be evolving differently. Of course, there might be different selection pressures. For whatever reason, the red mutation is good in this one population, but it might be bad in the other population. Again, these are all just very vague examples. We'll get to some more specifics as we go along. But also I wanted to point out that like we just talked about in one of the last videos, there's this thing called genetic drift, where having a small population size is going to allow the evolution to happen faster, basically, right? And so we would call this the penetrance of the new alleles, right? We don't have to change so many animals. If we only have a small group, then that small group can change rather quickly compared to the large group. And so you will see a lot of times that Genetic drift, like the founder effect or a bottleneck, often will lead to speciation. And here's just a little diagram showing how you have your beginning ancestral population, and then they split, and mutations happen in one, and different mutations happen in the other. So the longer you wait, the more and more these become different. And at some point, maybe these mutations become so different that the two groups can't mate anymore, right? And so there's two kind of categories to how it could work. There's a lot of different examples, but there's called allopatric speciation. And this is the most common one. Allo means different or separate. So here you have a population of trees that turns into two populations because they were separated physically by this barrier. And so on one side of the river, they stay the same. On the other side of the river, they change, and you get a new species. Now, there is a way called sympatric speciation on the right-hand side, where somehow a new species just kind of arises within all the other species. And this is a little bit harder to explain because when you're in the same place, the first question would be like, well, why aren't they reproducing, right? Because for speciation to happen, these, or at least the ancestors of these trees right here, can't reproduce with the ancestors of these other trees, but the other trees are all over the place near them. So like, what is keeping them from reproducing? That's a hard thing to do when you're living in the same place, but it can happen. And we'll try to talk about how it might happen. So these that we're going to talk about are called pre-zygotic barriers. The zygote is the first cell of a new organism. It's a fertilized egg, the egg and the sperm. So these barriers are going to keep it so that the egg and the sperm cannot meet each other. And I'm just going to go with this one first because this is the one I was kind of just talking about, geographic isolation. This is the most common way to think of speciation. Like you literally can't reproduce with something else if you're in a different place, right? And so maybe a river grew in between your big habitat, and now things on one side of the river can't mate with things on the other side of the river. There can be earthquakes that would separate things, right? There could be a fire that wipes out a whole huge section, and the animals on one side of the fire are very far away from the ones on the other side of the fire. There's all these different things. One kind of cool example of geographic isolation, or I think it's cool, it has to do with polar bears. Polar bears share a common ancestor with brown bears. Brown bears are also, grizzly bears are also types of brown bears. So grizzlies and polar bears and brown bears are all kind of very, very close to each other. But the polar bear is actually the newest of all the bear species. And it happened because of geographic isolation. During an ice age, something like 120,000 years ago, I forget the numbers. Numbers are not my favorite thing. The brown bears are walking across the ice, right? The huge ice sheets, like ice age kind of stuff. And then one group gets separated and like kind of cut off by some like glaciers or something like that. And they found an island right here, that Svalbard, I don't know how to say that, off the coast of Norway. And it's basically half the distance from Norway to the North Pole. The North Pole is like somewhere over here, right? There is no physical North Pole because there isn't always ice there. And of course, there's less and less now. But the point is that basically some bears get stuck way up here, right? Super far away from their from the brown bear counterparts that live down here in Europe, right? And so this gap on the ocean is too big. Now, the ice must have gone away at some point. I probably should have said that a little earlier, but the ice goes away. And so the bears that are stuck here are isolated from the bears that are here. And over time, these bears become polar bears, right? As they adapt to their new environment. Meanwhile, the brown bears stay brown bears because their environment is still kind of the same, right? So that's geographic isolation. Mechanical isolation, there's no picture for this one because this is pretty, we're not going to show a picture of this one, but morphology means body parts, right? Incompatible body parts, like you can't physically get the act to happen. I'm sure you could think of lots of examples of two animals that are so different that they can't even make sex occur. But behavioral isolation is a more interesting one. Now, this means incompatible behavior. Something is keeping the two groups from reproducing, even though they're in the same place at the same time, and they probably do have the same bodies and the ability to reproduce, but they just aren't. Now, some of the most famous examples come from birds because bird songs and mating rituals are all about getting a mate. insect songs also, right? When you hear crickets chirping, that little chirp is the little thing that says, "Hey, come over here. I'm over here," right? And so if those things change, then the female won't reproduce with you because it's usually the female that's being wooed. The male is trying to convince her, right? And so these birds right here are called the blue-footed boobies because they have blue feet, and people thought they were kind of dumb, and so they nicknamed them the boobies because that's like a boob is a dumb person in like some kind of weird slang over there in like England. But in any case, they do some interesting dances where the male will raise his feet up and down and do this little thing, and then he'll do this little pointing display where he lifts his head up and his wings in this crazy angle. And then there's also a third part that isn't on here where the male will pick up a little like a piece of grass and wave it around the female's head and then try to convince her to mate with him, right? And so if he does the proper dance, then the female will choose him. If he doesn't do the proper dance, then she won't choose him. But the interesting thing is that there are other versions of this bird or other species that are closely related, like these guys, which are the red-footed boobies. As you can see, they have red feet, and they have their own version of the courting and the mating dance, right? And so this is one where you could think of the sympatric speciation, where for some reason you have all these birds that all kind of mate. They all have the same mating dances and things, but maybe some male starts to do a weird dance. And usually this is bad, and it just means he doesn't get any females. But somehow this time he does get a female to mate with him. Maybe she has a mutation that allows her to be receptive to this new dance. And so they kind of form their own little group now, right? And so over time, there's more and more of these weird dancers. And then the birds from one group won't mate with this other group. The new group will only mate inside of their own little group, and over time they can mutations can pile up, their feet can turn red, and you get two species to happen in the same place. It's hard to visualize it, and I don't think that it happens a whole lot, but if it was going to happen, it's probably thanks to behavioral isolation. One last thing about behavioral isolation is that the act of choosing the mate is also a behavior. So the courting dances and the pointing displays and the songs, they usually get focused on as the behaviors. But the red feet and the blue feet are also part of the behavior too, because if you're one of these birds and you just see that bird with the red feet, you know, hey, that's not the blue-footed, I'm not looking for you, you don't have blue feet. And so that is a behavior, right? And so just not recognizing that the other animal is actually a potential mate, that is part of behavioral isolation, right? So it's not just the actions of the other individual, it's the way the other individual looks as well. All right, the last one for zygotic barriers is temporal isolation. You can't reproduce with something if they aren't around at the same time as you. So I know this says like breeding periods, but it also would be night versus day. Like if you're out there looking for a mate in the middle of the night, but most of the potential mates are all asleep, then it's not going to work out very well for you. If you're a wood frog who's for some reason really attracted to a bullfrog, it's too bad, because when it's April 1st and you're ready to go as the wood frog, the bullfrogs are not ready to go, and so they won't even allow you to reproduce with them because they're not ready to do it. So temporal isolation separates them by time. And so all of these are ways to keep the animals from having sex at all, right? But now we have post-zygotic barriers. Most of these have to do with genes. Zygote mortality is the main one, where if you somehow could get two species that are close enough that their bodies match up and they're at the right place at the right time with the right behaviors, and somehow they reproduce, or they actually do the act of intercourse, nothing's going to come out. There's not going to be any baby because the genes are just totally different and no embryo or zygote would live, right? And I know this is a weird one, but this is the whole, like, a human and a chimp can't have a baby. Nothing would ever come from that, even though theoretically it's possible. That's zygote mortality. Now, that usually has to happen after the pre-zygotic barriers, right? Because you can't, you got to be different enough for your genes to be not compatible, and that usually needs a long time being separated. But like I said, there are some animals that can reproduce, even though they're not what we would consider the same species. And so one example is the good old mule. This is between a horse and a donkey. Horses and donkeys they have a common ancestor. Hopefully that makes sense. They're similar enough that they haven't been separated that long, and their genes aren't that different. And so you can get a horse and a donkey to mate, and you get a mule. But a mule cannot make its own babies. They are infertile. It has to do with an odd number of chromosomes. I forget the number, but the horse has a certain number of chromosomes, right? And then when you get the egg and the sperm together, I believe you get something like 49 chromosomes. And so an odd number of chromosomes is bad because you can't, they're not going to split evenly, basically. I'm pretty sure that's the way it works. But in any case, the mules cannot have their own babies. And so the horses and the donkeys will forever stay as different species because they can't blend together to make the mule species. The liger is between a male lion and a female tiger. Same thing where they can make a baby. Tigers and lions must be close enough that they can have a real life baby, but this baby is not capable of having its own babies, which is probably a good thing for the world when these monsters are out there running in nature. Of course, this wouldn't happen in nature because in reality, lions live in Africa and tigers live in India and Asia, and they aren't ever going to meet each other. Why this even happens in zoos, I can only imagine is from just random curiosity. It seems a little odd that people are out there trying to get lions to have sex with tigers just because. Now, this one is called a beefalo. It's from a buffalo and a cow, right? Now, the beefalo is interesting because the beefalo can actually have its own babies. And so the buffalo and the cow must actually still be the same species, but because of the artificial barrier that is humans that keeps the cows separate from the buffaloes, there won't be any mating going back and forth, or there won't be a lot of it. And so the species stay separate. But if you think about it, that actually just means that they are the same species, but there is just this artificial barrier that keeps it there. Which brings me back to polar bears. This is a pizzly, a polar bear mixed with a grizzly bear, right? The polar bears and the grizzly bears, their ancestors split not too long ago. They are different, but also there are a lot of similarities, and so they can have their own babies, and the babies of these can actually have their own babies. They aren't, so a lot of ways, polar bears and grizzly bears are definitely the same species. But in this case, it's nature that keeps them separated because polar bears can't survive in the environment, in the niche that the brown bears occupy, and brown bears can't live where polar bears are. So again, in reality, they don't ever meet each other because they stay in their little spots. And so in nature, you don't usually find pizzlies out there too much, right? But in any case, reproductive isolation is absolutely necessary for speciation to happen. There's all these different ways to keep species from mating, and hopefully these examples make sense, and let me know if you have any questions.